most gracious, most merciful. May the peace of God be upon you. The GCC ship is facing several challenges at the regional and international level. It is a boat in a wavy ocean. It is looking for a good captain to lead it ashore. This is the objective of our session entitled GCC and the Regional Security Issues. And Dr. Raghid al-Solh will be starting with the first lecture. Dr. Raghid is a researcher, an intellectual, an expert when it comes to Arab and regional issues. He has a doctorate from Oxford University in political sciences, and he has 15 minutes to present his paper. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to start by thanking the Arab Center for having invited me. I would like to begin by talking about a very important issue. The GCC Gulf Cooperation Council was the result of several dialogues between the relationship between the regional and international forces, and these negotiations and dialogues were very important during the establishment of the Arab League. There were two opinions. The first one called for an entity of two levels, an Arab entity, regional entity, with all the Arab states as members, with no exceptions. So any Arab independent state that wanted to coordinate with other Arab countries politically could be member. The second layer is about states to reinforce cooperation between each other more than the Arab League, and they can sign mutual agreements to reinforce this cooperation. The second opinion accepted the birth of the Arab League and its charter. However, it had reservations regarding the inclusion of the sovereign states' right to go outside the charter. And the negotiations between Arab states founding the Arab League led to an agreement that prohibited other member states of signing agreements among each other, but it did not prohibit the creation of other organizations or body. However, it had some limitations. Did the GCC, after 36 years of the Arab League, was the GCC the implementation of this idea, sub-system of the Arabian system? The rules and regulations reinforce the GCC as a part of the Arab League. The 22nd article of the rules and regulations, or the rules of procedures, state that the Gulf Cooperation Council will be recognized by the Arab League and the United Nations as well. And the objective of the GCC is to achieve the objective of the Arab countries, and it is in line with the bigger chart of the Arab League achieving all the objectives. The Gulf Cooperation Council is the result of the ambition of the people of the country, and it was impossible to achieve these aspirations and ambitions without the creation of a certain body. This is why the forefathers, the founding fathers, not only agreed to this unification of forces, but they wanted to provide an opportunity to move forward in order to achieve the objectives. These were very important to the regional bodies, but there were several questions. The impossibility of achieving unification, does it mean that the founding fathers were desperate and could not or did not believe that they were capable of achieving this unity? Or does it mean that although they have agreed on the creation of this council, they still believe that the unity is possible? Is the GCC similar to several bodies in other parts of the world as part of other unions? And what is the objective of the GCC? Is it similar to the other systems like the EU or the Schengen or the EFTA states? Or was it a different purpose when it comes to neutrality vis-a-vis the Arab League? The answer to these questions need to review the entire experience of the GCC when it comes to unified Arab world and the operation of its institutions, and it needs more than these 15 minutes. Here, we would like to talk briefly about the situation and the relationship between the Arab League and GCC, and how can the role of GCC increase in order to empower the regional Arab system, and we would like to offer some suggestions at this level. The main objective of these suggestions is to protect the region from the challenges that are facing, that the Gulf region in particular is facing, and it is causing a lot of trouble, and it is worsening the situation in the Gulf countries. This level of challenge is fluctuating recently with the international terrorism in the region. We have the security threat as a main priority, and the first level of threats or challenges, we have direct challenges which the Gulf countries face, and these are centered around the policies with the relationship with the NATO countries, United States, Israel, Iran, and international terrorism. At the level of the US relations, several people consider that the main security challenge is the possibility of the lack of respect by the US of Carter law. And this change is the result of the latest changes in the US, the rise of China, and the US reclaiming its role as oil exporter. Three, the decision of the US foreign policy to adopt a neutral position vis-a-vis the world. Regionally, we know that the Israeli challenge is always existent, and this is why it's not pressing need. However, I think it has becoming a pressing need on the shorter run, in my opinion, because the Palestinian state as option is done, and it's no longer possible. And we can see the Israeli extremes playing a major role, and such an explosion in the Holy Land, the GCC would not be put aside when it comes to the repercussions. When it comes to Iran, the challenge of Iran is similar to the challenge of Israel. when it comes to its importance and pressing nature. However, the entity that continued to uh, launch wars after the wars is different than another entity that is capable of becoming friend of GCC countries. The Iranian leaders consider that they have achieved this requirement by supporting the Palestinians. This requirement is necessary, however, it is not enough since Tehran still regards this region as the part of this region, and the Iran wants to play the role of the police of the Gulf. International terrorism is a pressing challenge, and it is among the external challenges because it is international now in light of the increasing numbers of terrorist organizations from abroad, and since it's presenting a phenomenon that is not only limited to Arab countries. The second form of challenges is the long run or long term challenges: China, Russia, India, and Turkey. Turkey is the closest to become the hegemonic power, and achieving this objective is up to international standards that have not been achieved yet, and these challenges are indirect. China, as well, did not reach its peak yet, however, it is speeding toward achieving its objective. It is still under the indirect challenge. When it comes to the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, they are capable of defending themselves against limited regional attacks, and GCC should reinforce these capacities and capabilities when it comes to uh, several laws within the countries. However, the conjuncture shows that this mission is impossible, maybe. This is why Gulf countries are trying to put a security framework to these challenges, and the international community is supporting GCC countries at this level. However, the repercussions of international uh, situations is very clear in the GCC, and maybe this is why the strategy to protect the Gulf should be reviewed. The alternatives do not achieve the objective because the United States and Iran's agreement did not create a peaceful situation in the GCC. The results are close to the friendly agreement between France and the UK in the 1940s, where the Arabs paid the price. As to the US supporting the security of the Gulf after the Republicans back to the Congress, I don't think that the general population of the US does not want to be involved in the foreign affairs. Maybe Republicans and Democrats have become more conservative when it comes to protecting the United States from the repercussions of the situations abroad. And Israel's role is still increasing as well. In light of these projects, some people resort to the Arab solution. It is not new, it has been there since the creation of the regional Arab regime, but several issues ruined the system. Would it be possible to revive it once again? Some Arab countries are trying to achieve this objective by creating Arab alliances or trying to revive the regional system. I will be brief because apparently I still have 2 minutes. I will focus on how the Arab or the Gulf countries could help revive the regional Arab system or regime. I think that GCC countries play a major role at the regional and international level, especially after the developments that have weakened other Arab countries that were playing a very important regional position. And GCC countries have all the interest that it takes to recruit all possible efforts to face all the challenges that we have talked about. So there are some suggestions suggested by two Gulf countries to reform the regional Arab system. One, the most important problem in the regional system is the taking the decisions but not implementing these decisions. Some suggestions were elaborating mechanisms to implement the decisions of the Arab League. Two, the amendment of the election rules. Three, building the political will to necessary to activate the decisions and the implementation of the decisions. And the last point triggers several questions. How can we build these political? How can we build these political wills? Is it from within the Arab countries? These suggestions do not mention how to move from the lack of these political wills to the presence of these political wills. Maybe the Arab Center for Research and Studies could study this aspect, especially when it comes to the conferences that are before the Arab League summit in March. Maybe another Arab summit or conference should include some Arab researchers and intellectuals who study these issues and independent organizations and bodies in order to create a new agenda to promote the regional system. Otherwise, I think it will be very hard to do so. And I think that the protection of the security of the Gulf and the regional system of Arab countries would be impossible. Thank you. Thank you for this valuable intervention. Dr. Dhafer al-Ajmi, the Chief Executive Officer from Waqf al-Khalij. He is in charge of the security of Gulf studies, and he has a doctorate from Cambridge in the UK. And he had a study about the security of the Arabian Gulf. The floor is yours. Thank you, Dr. Sarhan. Dr. Raghid Sulaiman has given me more time to talk than 15 minutes. I will be talking about the security of the Gulf when it comes to unconventional military system. So we will start talking about the conventional military structures before moving to the unconventional. Some people have acceptance to colonial powers, and the protection of the West has created an isolation for the rulers of the Gulf, and they have accepted the protection of the West. And if we accept colonialism, we accept the protection of the West. I will be talking about the conventional arrangements of the West, including the agreement of protection of the UK. That was the last layer of the agreements signed with the British in the 19th century until the 1971.
These were only one-sided. Some Emirates got involved in more comprehensive agreements than others. The agreements represented another form of the Western presence which should be looked at in the historical context of the West's relationship with the Gulf and Britain's relationship with the Gulf also, which took the shape of protection treaties sometimes and maritime protection and until Britain's withdrawal from the east of Suez. The second type was the Gulf area was part of the Cold War structure through what was known the Persian Corridor to which was developed further. The corridor was developed into a trench against communism made up of the Gulf countries and the Shah of Iran at that time. So Washington encouraged the Baghdad Pact and the Twin Pillars and also placed the security of the Gulf on the shoulders of Iran and Saudi Arabia. Then Carter's approach after the fall of the Shah and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And Carter's principle was based on the strongest indicator of linking America's security with the security of the Gulf. The third type was establishing bases through security arrangements or agreements, and this is what we saw after the liberation of Kuwait. Traditional conventional Western presence saw an increase under the SOFA status of forces agreement, which meant that the forces will be protected from any legal responsibility, similarly to what was being adopted with France and Britain. Also, the strategic approach was more or less the same, although the tactics were different, especially after the fall of the collapse of the Arab order as a result of the invasion of Kuwait and the very fragile peace accords known as the Oslo agreements. And eventually we ended up with the concept of the Gulf security being an entirely Gulf concept rather than being part and parcel of a more comprehensive Arab order. Coalition Task Force is a force which is made up of 28 countries, which led to the militarization of the maritime corridors. It started with Operation Against Terrorism, Perpetual Freedom, and in addition to the Gulf countries' naval forces to combat terrorism, high seas crimes, and other tasks. And this is the result of the global militarization adopted by NATO. And it's based on having something like 1,000 naval units to control the high seas and the corridors, exactly what the British and Portuguese wanted to establish before. And if we wanted to calculate the financial risks and the lack of the political umbrella under which this pact is operating, makes us wonder, are we faced with a new military pact, or are they similar to the kind of agreements Kuwait has signed? So therefore, can we expect now to see some Chinese and Russian ships also? So anyway, although the Operation Perpetual Freedom has ended many years ago, why do we still have the presence of the forces? And this acts as a contributor to the instability in the area, and Iran to claim that it's us, the Gulf countries, who are causing this instability. The other thing I'd like to talk about the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative of the year 2004, which is, in the opinion of some, a major development, a positive development in cooperation between Gulf countries and the West. Although this is different than reality because security has not been enhanced almost a decade later after it was established. Although the pact, like when we talk about NATO, NATO has been faithful to defending its members as it was in the days of the Warsaw Pact, it is now. But Iran still has operatives in Kuwait and also sleeping cells and interference in Bahrain, and occupies the 3 islands belonging to the UAE. The NATO was very clear with us right from the start that they will not accept us as members, but the new vision they revealed for the NATO shows that they want to play an alternative role to that of the Security Council, and through maybe what was known as Greater Middle East. We expected NATO to be the main partner in security arrangements, but the representatives of NATO did not want to deal with the GCC countries collectively, but they prefer to deal with them individually, as if to give the impression that they do not believe in the system. The lily pad means, as a concept talked about, that the United States, which operates over 60 bases around the world, wants some bases like the ones established in Kuwait to have some special forces units, and we saw recently how the A-10s arrived in Kuwait and some marine units. We lost the voice in translation. We cannot hear the speaker in translation. Now we feel that this will involve Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Yemen, and will take us back to the Cold War era. The West has not stopped raising the strategic involvement, the ceiling of the strategic involvement in the Gulf. They always try to dismantle previous structures and start new ones. In the eyes of the West, the Gulf is still important strategically and does not want to give up its military presence in the Gulf, although the policies implemented will be the same as the traditional and conventional presence. And this presence, by the way, is not only to counter Iranian influence, but it's casting It's casting its shadow now on the entire region. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Dhafer. Last but not least, Mr. Suhaim al-Thani, who is a researcher at the Arab Center. He holds an MA in International Relations from Royal Holloway in Britain. Thank you, Dr. Sarhan, in the name of God, most merciful, most compassionate.
I will be talking about the GCC as an active test. The problems that the GCC is facing as an active player when it comes to facing challenges that we are seeing today. The Gulf Cooperation Council is a continuation of what was of this security complex. Dr. Gregory talked about it. It is about oil countries. Test. Can you hear me? Test. I'm talking. Test. Test. Can you hear me?
حصل تأسيس مجلس التعاون الخليجي سنة 1981 كان الميشن ستيتمنت في أبو ظبي أنهم يهدفون إلى صيغة تعاونية تضم الدول الست تهدف إلى تحقيق التنسيق والتكامل والترابط بين دولهم في جميع الميادين وصولا إلى وحدتها وفق ما نص عليه النظام الأساس للمجلس في مادته الرابعة. طبعا هذا الشيء يعني لم يحدث الآن بعد كم سنة؟ 33
Can you hear me?
وأين نحن الآن؟
Can you hear me? Okay.
طبعا في مشاريع كثيرة.
There are several projects that were not implemented for the Gulf Cooperation Council in 2007 in Doha. The unified Gulf market was announced, and in 2011, the securities were included in the GCC countries as an advisory measure before implementing it as obligatory measure. The railway linking between Kuwait, the north of Kuwait, and Oman in the south, and going through Bahrain, Dammam, and Qatar, also was not achieved. So currently, the GCC is studying the unified tourist visa and the military cooperation, and the unified currency. Unified currency is very important, and for GCC, coordination is at advanced levels, and several Gulf countries have expressed their will to resort to unified currency in 2013, and some countries have complained. And of course, it is a sovereign state, a sovereign right for every country, and we do not know what will happen when it comes to the unity in the future. The unified military leadership, the Bahrain minister said that a unified headquarters will be in Saudi Arabia to face Iran and ISIL, and hundreds of thousands of soldiers will be linked with this headquarters, and Saudi Arabia will participate with no less than 100,000 soldiers. I think it's difficult to achieve. My vision. Sorry, we cannot hear the intervention because they're not using the microphone. So I think it's difficult. The evolution will be similar to that of the European Union. It will be slow and it will take decades. And some countries will object. And cooperation at the level of the economics will be easier than military and security cooperation. And we'll be talking about decades where countries can be active role players in organizations that are that tackle economic issues and not security and military issues. This can change after the unified military headquarters establishment, but it is difficult to achieve its purposes, and the GCC will be ready to find solutions to economic problems, but it will not be active when it comes to facing challenges in the region unless it's a direct threat. I would like to set a comparison between the European Union and GCC economically and socially. If we set the parallels, visa exemptions for EU citizens, for example, and compared with the GCC, the right of GCC citizens to live and work in any of the states of the GCC. These measures were taken by European countries, unified financial market for the Gulf. It is also a parallel measure to that of the EU, supporting Bahrain and Oman, similarly to the EU supporting Eastern and Southern Europe. Security, at the level of security and military, there are military parallels as well. The GCC is better when it comes to finding solutions to internal threats. However, when it comes to foreign threats, the EU was not active when it comes to the Soviet threat, and the GCC could not support Iraq against Iran or the crisis of Kuwait, and the EU could not deal the security issues after the fall of the Soviet Union. It was left to the NATO, and the GCC in parallel after the fall of the regime of Saddam Hussein did not take serious measures to find solutions to the solution. EU did not find the solutions in Bosnia, and the GCC could not find solutions in Syria and Iraq. The parallels are clear. The reason behind these parallels, despite the difference in the culture, civilizations, etc., economy is not a game that ends with zero. However, politics can end with a zero score. The economic cooperation is therefore easier than political cooperation in any of the bodies around the world, and the slow economic growth is caused because of the crises in Europe. They've suffered from the stagflation, and then the currency depreciation in Italy and Greece, etc. We do not face these issues now. With the decrease of the oil prices, there might be a bigger motivation to implement the projects that were agreed upon. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Suhaim. We'll take some of the answers and comments. We still have 20 minutes for the discussions. I would have preferred having written questions in order to be fairer when it comes to the division. But we cannot hear the speaker. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have simple questions. The panelists focus on some issues. First of all, my first question is, what is the influence of the decrease of the price of the oil on the security of GCC? 2, the rise of ISIL and Gulf jihadists. How can we deal with it? 3, how can we deal with the division of Iraq and the continuous civil war in Syria? 4, dealing with terrorism and the intervention of Iran in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. 5. The Houthis in Yemen and the expansion of their influence. How can we deal with it? Thank you. The question is addressed to everybody. Dr. Shaman Yusuf Isa from Kuwait University. Muhammad Saad al-Muqaddam from Sultan Qaboos University, Oman. Can you hear me? Doctor has talked about the unified Arab regime. Of course, I don't know how can we preserve it in light of the changes that we are seeing on a daily basis after the Arab Spring. The issue that was tackled by Dr. Dhafer, the security of the Gulf and the protection of the British Empire, and the Cold War, and all these concepts after the invasion of Kuwait. Of course, there has been several changes. Therefore, in the morning, I was talking about the security of the Gulf, and as it was mentioned by one of the colleagues, when we talk about the security of the Gulf and the Gulf unity and the identity of the Gulf people, how can we preserve the unified identity of the Gulf in light of these changes that we have been talking about during this session? Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Undoubtedly, the changes at the regional and international level result in threats to the very existence of the Gulf region. The second determining factor that I would like to mention is the issue of security. The imported security comes with a lot of threats and poses restraints on the political decision makers and economic decision makers as well. Therefore, I think that it is possible to find a solution to the structural vulnerability of the GCC, especially when it comes to demographic aspect. In my opinion, it is impossible to find a solution to the structural vulnerability unless Yemen joins the GCC. And this demographic vulnerability would be treated or dealt with. If we keep on spending a lot on the military and we have low demographic growth, we will not find a solution. However, when Yemen joins GCC country, the population of the GCC will be better, and we would cover this gap. And Yemen is not a burden to the GCC. Yemen can be a plus or an added value to the GCC. It can be a space for secure GCC investments in Yemen. These were the points that I wanted to mention. I have reached these points by listening to the panelists who agreed that the security issue is very dangerous and we should deal with it. Thank you. Please mention your names. Microphone, please. Microphone. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Abdul Wadar Asiri from Kuwait University. I have two questions. First, to the organizers of this conference. This conference is about the GCC countries, politics and economics in light of the changes at the regional and international level. So it means that we should listen to people who are interested in this region. We have specialized people, colleagues from GCC countries, from Arab countries, other Gulf countries, from China to Washington. But I would like to ask the organizers, is any of them from Iran or linked with Iran, although it is a major actor in the region? Dr. Raghid al-Solh mentioned the role of the police of the Gulf. Let me clarify one point. I have been back from Iran for a visit. I was there for a visit of 11 days. 18 Kuwaiti academics were there from different fields, cultural, educational, humanitarian. We visited 4 cities, 2 religious cities, Mashhad Akum, political, Tehran, cultural, Asfahan. We met religious leaders, politicians, MPs, media actors. They have the will. Iran, I don't want to talk about Iran. I don't think that Iran thinks about this concept of the police of the Gulf anymore. This idea is long gone. It needs a regional agreement. We need made in GCC security. It doesn't mean that we should do away with our relationship with others. In Kuwait, we think that the best solution is the relationship between institution, soft policy, and the different institutions of the society. So I didn't continue. Thank you. I didn't have the time to continue. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Dr. Amjad or Ahmed, is it? I don't know. Amjad Jibril. Thank you, Chair. I want to make my intervention between Dr. Raghid and Dr. Dhafer. I would like to see them to have a debate between them before presenting it. I think Dr. Dhafer says there is no place for inter-Arab or inter-Gulf arrangements, and Dr. Raghid says the opposite. So I would like to ask, the inter-Arab relations always move from solidarity to conflict, and more often than not, differences between Arab countries are just lowered in intensity for a short period of time before they inflamed again, rather than settled once and for all. We remember the Damascus Declaration in 1990, which has been forgotten about. I asked Sheikh Suhaim also what extent the lack of democracy in the GCC countries impacted the GCC as an operating system for these countries. Although there is many similarities, we know, but sometimes we see the conflict level arising unproportionately to the situation on the ground. For example, when we make comparisons with the European Union, we see more balance in the European Union and its workings than the GCC. So finally, I asked Dr. Raghid, does he think that the GCC as a system can provide the basis for an Arab order, some sort of on the grounds that some people see it as a catalyst for that or to lead the Arab order. Dr. Ammar Jaffar. Thank you, Chair. I noticed that some interventions, starting with Mr. Raghid, al-Solh, and others, when they talk about security, we always tend to run outwardly and say the reasons and the fault lies outside the region, as if to say that internally there are no threats at all and the threats only from the outside. Is this really true? When we compare, for example, the demographic situation, this is more serious as a threat than Iran and more threatening than Israel. My second observation is about the GCC. I think sometimes we burden the GCC with more than what it can cope with, and the previous setbacks in attempts at unity by Arabs left us thinking that any achievement, no matter how small, as a big achievement. The GCC, and contrary to what Dr. Raghid al-Solh thinks, started as a security arrangement. It was a quick reaction, albeit a wise one, on the repercussions of the Iran-Iraq war and the Iranian Revolution. And I think the rulers of the Gulf at that time took an opportune decision, but it was security-based nonetheless, and I think it's been obsessed with the security aspect until today. So it is more of a security arrangement than 20 seconds more, please. And we can tell by the very limited economic successes and almost non-existent political ones. So therefore, the rulers of the region have to take or make some strategic choices, and painful ones for that matter. Thank you. Dr. Rabia. Assalamu alaikum, Rafiq Abbas from the Emirates. I agree with what Dr. Dhafer has said, and I want to pose a direct question. Is there one Gulf country which has its own independent political decision-making ability? And is there an Arab country which can claim that too? Secondly, we know we don't have the abilities to be really independent, and will always be subject to other countries and people's influences. But I think what we can benefit from is the attitude of our own people, the masses. When you look at the situation now, you see that the bar has been lowered a great deal, and when it comes to the freedoms, and as for what Mr. Suhaim has said, I used to be provost of the university for 8 years, and please don't get upset if I say what I'm going to say. I've never seen backwardness when it comes to administering the affairs of the GCC as I've seen with the GCC itself. And if the Arab nation was plagued with one disease called the Arab League, I think the GCC can be added to that list. Dr. Abdul Hadi. First of all, I thank all the presenters, but my question is to Dr. Dhafer. In the analysis he presented, he talked about how the mechanisms of the West's dealing with the GCC have been changing, and when we look at the history of the Gulf rulers, we will find that sometimes there were some rulers who managed to negotiate their way through path of dealing with different forces. Now, the Gulf rulers, do they really know how to negotiate? Do they have the power, the independence? What is the potential that the GCC can deal successfully, diplomatically, with any of the issues before it? Thank you. Dr. Majdi Amr. Assalamu alaikum. Majdi Amr from Palestine. I specialize in Israeli affairs. All our speakers focused on Iran, but as the enemy of the Gulf now, I just want to remind everybody that we forget that the real enemy, which constitutes a threat to the entire Arab world, is Israel and the Zionists. And secondly, what Shimon Peres once said, that we can live with Iran as a nuclear power because we have a nuclear deterrent ourselves. So when the Arab countries and the Gulf countries talk about nuclear threats, whether from Iran or Israel, where is their deterrence? They've spent all this money on weapon system, but they have never managed to stand up to Israel or Iran. Dr. Ahmed Abu Zaid. Ahmed Abu Zaid from the Emirates. I have two questions to Dr. Raghid. Please be brief, please. We have no time. The title of this conference is when Suhaim talks about security arrangements, what vision are you basing that on? Please speak closer to the mic. Please do not respond until the questioner finishes. As the doctrine, what vision do they base it? What is the vision of the GCC according which they deal with the issues facing them? We cannot hear the speaker without a microphone. Your second question, yes, the GCC's vision and its role in the security arrangements. Also, in your paper, you spoke about four main threats. In your opinion, are these the only ones? Secondly, you said that there is no unified strategy. What is your unified strategy? And you also talked about the GCC moving to knowledge-based economy. So do you think this is the solution to our problems? Dr. Khalil? Thank you, first of all, Chair. And our thanks go to the presenters. Thank you very much for your valuable presentations. I just want to draw your attention to one thing. It's not just the GCC, for example, does not have problems uniformly like other countries. For example, Saudi does not have a demographic problems, but its problems are different. It's like corruption or lack of reform. Secondly, we must talk about other problems which come from countries outside, like Iraq, and the dangers it's representing now. So I want our speakers to elaborate on these issues. And I'm happy with what Dr. Rafia has said, that we have problems in the academic structure. I'm not talking about education, but the academic structure in the Gulf countries. And I hope these meetings will end up contributing to. We want our universities to be real universities and not just advanced secondary schools. And I would like our thinkers to be independent and not just be obsessed by problems of their countries. Dr. Muhammad al-Misfar. Thank you, Chair. To start with, since this morning we've been talking about Gulf security, but more importantly, our decision makers in the Gulf have the political will to have a proper Gulf security in every aspect of the meaning of the word, or are they already part of agreements with outside forces which do not allow them to be there? And shouldn't we be thinking that real security comes from our relationships as countries with our own citizens? Thirdly, when it comes to security cooperation, unfortunately, we have linked our security with foreign powers that we have no leverage on. People talk about immunity for American soldiers on our soil. It's not just the soldiers. All Americans are immune from any legal responsibility about anything. Also, what is the real role to activate the GCC? I know Dr. Qais has alluded to this. Yemen is a strategic necessity for the GCC to deal with, but not the Yemen ruled by the Houthis. Also, Iraq, but not through the sectarian regime which is ruling Iraq. I want Jordan to be important player and part of our system because Jordan is situated between Iraq and Iran on the one hand and Israel on the other. And I do not like to see Iranian influence expanding into Jordan from Afghanistan and Iraq. And so therefore we desperately need a political will on behalf of the GCC leaders, and I know they're going to meet in a summit in 2 days' time to deal with the question of their own citizens. I have 4 more papers and questions. We have two minutes. Whoever wants to be very brief, I'll give him the opportunity. Salah ad-Din Qadri. Salahuddin al-Qadri from Paris in France. Since this morning, we've been hearing about the agenda of the others. And of course, it's no surprise that others have their agendas. The problem is we do not have our own agenda as Arabs, and the total failure of the Arab project to establish a country based on citizens and citizenship. If we take the Iran example, Iran was not a country based on citizens' rights, but it is a sectarian region. But it dealt successfully from its point of view with Iraq, the Houthis, and the Bahrain. So even if the Arab countries play the same game, it would have been better for them because the Gulf now is at the heart of a project which is politically divided and sectarianly divided. And this is a big problem. And I think this is the biggest threat facing the GCC. Dr. Bshari. Assalamu alaikum. My question is to Dr. Raghid. As Israel being a source of threat, and also because of the Islamic identity of the Gulf countries, my question is, for example, if Israel destroys the Al-Aqsa Mosque tomorrow, what makes you think that the Gulf people will move as Muslims? Dr. Abdullah Ba'aboud. Thank you, Chair. Abdullah Ba'aboud from Qatar University. I have some quick questions. We don't have time for questions. One question, please. What security are we talking about? Are we talking about security of the state, the nation state, the security of the oil resources, or the West? What about the threats to the security in the region? Until now, we have not understood what you mean. Some countries consider some political Islamist movements as terrorist organizations. Who decides that? And also, we talked about everything except what we should be talking about, and that is the lack of trust and confidence between the leaders of the GCC countries. Mr. Aql. Thank you, Chair. My question to Dr. Dhafer. Are the GCC governments able to neutralize to separate the security of the region than competitions? Last question, please, Dr. Abdullah. I gave the pieces of paper on which you've written your questions to the speakers. Thank you, Chair. The basic problem that we still have not dealt with decisively with are what are the real threats that we are facing, and why is it that the GCC countries, after all these years, not managed to form a security organization of some sort or infrastructure, and we cannot protect ourselves from the inside. The latest developments indicate that there is this conference and there is Al-Manama annual conference on the Gulf security, which is very important. Now we see the Western forces coming back. We have a French base in Abu Dhabi. Yesterday, the British Foreign Secretary signed an agreement with the Bahraini Minister for Foreign Affairs, an agreement to establish a British naval base in Bahrain. And Philip Hammond, the British Foreign Secretary, said, your security concern is our security concern. So therefore, are we now witnessing a return that with the retreat of the Americans and the rise of ISIL and the other developments, that are we seeing a return of the other Western powers? This is a serious indication we should take into account. Why has the GCC failed, which was established for mainly security and defense reasons, and change into other problematic issues? Why don't we do something to make us sufficient in dealing with our security? This is very important and sensitive issue. I think that we should have been given more time, but in fact, the importance of this theme, Dr. Ibrahim Al-Hadwan, I just invite you to read the little Sparta article on the Washington Post, which talks about the role of the UAE, which is marketing itself as an alternative to Saudi Arabia. Everybody now focusing on Washington. Everybody is trying to prove to Washington that I am your man. We can talk here until the cows come home, but Washington is who we should deal with and talk to. Thank you very much for all your questions, and they go into the heart of the matter, but now we give the speakers a time. Dr. Raghid, we'll start with you to respond. Thank you. I give each speaker 3 minutes. Maybe we will increase them to 5 minutes.
انت اذا بدك تروح ترتاح يا دكتور، مش هاي اخر شيء؟ خلص هلا اخر شيء، اذا بدك تروح ترتاح او شيء. So I think that the international community think that there's a gap to be filled in the Arab region, and I think the foundation of this gap is the situation in general. We have 6 regional powers: Morocco, Algeria, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Iraq. Iraq is destroyed. Iraq has been destroyed when the military didn't play a role anymore. Syria has been destroyed and will continue to be so. Egypt is suffering a lot at the economic level, thus political level as well. Morocco and Algeria, they have conflicts that do away with their role. This is when it comes to the regional powers. When it comes to regular countries, they have limited capacities. We have a lot of natural resources in the region, but they are not being used. The impression is that this region is free for everyone who's got ambitions to seize the opportunity and benefit and fill the cart of the shopping list items. And it's like going to the supermarket and shopping for some items. So the question of the organizers, how can we find a solution to this situation? Of course, there's a theory that says that the GCC security is up to the the Council itself. The GCC is using all capacities at the regional, GCC, and international level to face ISIL, for example. In London, they are afraid of ISIL, not only here. And in the United States, there is a lot of fear of these international terrorist organizations based in this region. It is very important that the GCC is considering the security aspect, and some countries, including Qatar, decided to start taking security measures and military measures. Even small countries can recruit human resources to defend the country. So we should not only talk about the GCC, but it's a general Arab issue. In Lebanon, we suffer a lot from these problems, not only in the Gulf. And we try to find solutions to these challenges. The oldest regional Arab system is not taken seriously, but I hope that things will change in the future. We remember the October War 1973 compared to the 1967. A lot of achievement has taken place in 73 and starting 73 when Arab League member states started implementing some decisions. What was implemented in the 1973 are some of the decisions to prepare for war. Coordination took like 6 months between Syria, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. The results were very fruitful. And Israel considered that Israel will disappear, and this is what Kissinger and Nixon were told, and this is why the aviation bridge was created. So if we study this theory, we can repeat it maybe. However, we should stick to the decisions and implementing the decisions. Iran and Israel. Who said this comparison? This is not true. I don't think any of the speakers said that Iran is like Israel. Always say that there's a difference between the two. However, ladies and gentlemen, when power is rising, Iran is a rising power because of the dynamic society, and Iran has the right to do so. And not any of the countries have the right to prevent Iran from rising. Iran is a member of an important system. If Iran has these dynamics to expand its market and its regional relationships, the Central Asian republics and surrounding states can cooperate with each other in order to have mutual cooperation and respect. However, I'm afraid that sometimes Arab countries need to be taken separately in order to reinforce the Iranian hegemony. As an example, there was a study that was published by Gayhan Barzegal, written by Gayhan Barzegal, who's very close to the ruling regime in Iran. He says that dialogue is between GCC and Iran is unnecessary, is pointless, and there should be a dialogue between the US and Iran in order to decide about the future of the region. Why? The GCC-Iran dialogue leads to a balance of power, balancing powers. What powers are we talking about? The United States from one side and the other side as Iran. And I'm talking from an Iranian perspective, not my personal perspective. So these are not predetermined policies. There is no constitution that has stipulated that this is the policy of Iran. However, there should be a dialogue between the Arabs and Iran, the Gulf countries and Iran, very transparent and honest dialogue. They have some points to criticize us. They should be free to say them, and we as well. In brief, I suggest that the GCC should be have a leverage effect for the general regional system, and the GCC has got several resources that can be used in this context, even if the cooperation within the GCC is not at its best. However, the GCC has a lot of resources, not only economically, but also politically. In terms of human resources, the GCC should have the leverage effect, and the entire regional Arab system will benefit, and the Arab League as well. Thank you. The floor is yours, sir. 2 minutes. I will start talking about the last point that was mentioned by my colleague, Mr. Fadl Al-Asir, talked about the situation of Iran. Of course, we do not consider that Iran is an enemy. Even in the headquarters of the Gulf countries, Iran is not considered these academies as a potential enemy. This is not true. Iran is a neighbor. Iran is a neighbor. However, we live in a country, in a region with a bad neighborhood. Iran is a neighbor. Sometimes the situation or the situation is bad with this neighbor. Sometimes it's good. Sometimes we have provocative maneuvers. For example, instigation in Bahrain, spying networks. This is why Iran can be a bad neighbor. And when Iran is doing well, we consider that Iran is a good neighbor. We do not compare Iran to Israel at any level. The second point is regarding the political decision and whether we have this political decision. I cannot answer this in terms of the link between the political and military decision. We have refused several military projects. The missile system from 7 to 10 years ago was rejected. The Saudis did away with the American bases, the U.S. military bases. Several decisions show that the GCC countries have sovereign decisions, and several people give examples of that the GCC countries do not have this sovereignty. When it comes to the GCC security system, yes, the security system in the Gulf is becoming less and less, and sub-security systems are becoming the trend. And when it comes to the security of the Gulf, it is a series of circles, inner circle of every state, the collective security of the GCC. And unfortunately, we have security within NATO because it comes before the cooperation with the Arab countries. As we have said, Syria and Egypt have lost their power. Some people talked about the dialogue of Damascus. The Gulf Cooperation Council could not agree to that because of the economic burden. Dr. Shaiji mentioned the base in Bahrain. It's not a new base, it's an expansion of the base. And 10 years ago, the Bahraini government was reluctant, but now they have given the authority to expand some of the facilities and not create a new military base. And I would like to say that there's a deficiency in terms of determining the source of threat between GCC countries. Some people consider Iran, some people consider other countries. The source of this threat has not been determined, and this is the cause of the problem. Dr. Al-Hadi talked about the Gulf leaders and the political decision taken to have an agreement with the NATO. Unfortunately, GCC is the biography of every ruler. When you want to go back to the history, you read the biography of the rulers, not the history of the country. And this needs to be worked on, maybe different studies. And the GCC countries cannot do a lot at this level. There has been a lot of plans with the Russians or the NATO, and NATO is established, or the relationship with the NATO has been established since 50 years. It's better for us to stay with the NATO, therefore. Thank you. Try to be brief. Regarding Dr. Anwar, the regional security complex means that the states within this complex perceive each other as sources of increased security or decreased security. Iraq, Iran, and the GCC are linked, and Iran and Iraq can be sources of threats to the GCC. Regional security complex does not mean that they are unified. You have talked about the abstract. I have tried to summarize the abstract, tackled several issues. I cannot mention them in 15 minutes. I have given the bullet points, reaching the structural problems of the GCC. Of course, I have 15 minutes and the time is not enough. As to the democracy, as an individual, and I do not represent my government, I say that democracy does not build institutions better than the others. European Union is the biggest example. After 50 years, the UK is saying that it wants to withdraw from this institution. And some people say that we cannot express our viewpoints. However, we have seen today a lot of things have been said against the GCC and rulers and leaders, and nobody is going to be imprisoned. Will any of you be imprisoned and the name is taken and put in prison? No, it's never happened. You can talk and say whatever you want. We remember the 60s and the 50s. We say, no, we cannot talk. We do not have the right, the freedom of expression. Nobody has interrupted you. You have all been able to tackle all the issues that you want. As to this concept of democracy, I have been talking about this issue in the morning. Okay, democracy has led to al-Dawah in Iraq. Do you like it? No, I don't like. What do you want to do? Do you want to impose it? Democracy has led to Hezbollah in Lebanon. Do you like Hezbollah? No, you don't like Hezbollah. So what do we do? They vote with Iran, not against Iran. So they vote and choose the same people. So do you want to force democracy into the throats of people? But a lot of people consider that democracy is a liberal regime, and the Islamists want to implement the Sharia law, and Islamists are against liberals, and Sunnis are against Shias, and they talk about democracy. So, of course, we choose the aspects of democracy that we want, and I do not accept the others. So they don't agree, they don't understand the principle of democracy. Hezbollah, al-Dawah, they are all democracy. How would you be able to explain these concepts to people who do not like these concepts but still want to have democracy in their countries? Nuruddin Abdul Qadir, the question regarding Iraq and Syria being out of the defense system and its influence on the GCC. Of course, it has a big influence. Iraq does not have air support, and we have seen that Iran bombed ISIS fighters 2 days ago. Regarding the effect of the Republicans being in power, ISIS and terrorist, post Al Qaeda terrorist need measures, post Obama measures. So post Al Qaeda terrorism needs post Obama measures. I'd like to thank the speakers, panelists, and thank you for your contributions.